his life all figured out, until a brief encounter with a stranger shakes everything. Haunted by her past and afraid to face the truth, she's forced to choose: stay stuck or grow. A Chance Called Grace is a powerful coming-of-age story about healing, faith, and finding purpose in the most unexpected way. Welcome to her storyline, where young girls chase dreams, build friendships, and face real-life challenges. If you love stories that inspire and feel real, you're home. Like, comment, and subscribe. Your story matters too. Now, step into the story with us. At 19, Barbara had perfected the art of looking fine. She was always neatly dressed, her phone constantly in hand, and her life goals planned 3 years ahead. But life, as always, had its own timing, and often ignored hers. Barbara came rushing down the concrete steps of the lecture hall, her black leather backpack hanging awkwardly from one shoulder, half zipped. In one hand, she fumbled with tangled earphones. Her brows were furrowed in frustration as she muttered to herself. Barbara muttered, "Great, just great. One lecture, Barbara. One important lecture and you miss it. Fantastic." Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Amaka, her best friend. With a loud huff, Barbara answered the call. Barbara said, "Don't even ask." From the other end, Amaka laughed. Amaka replied, "Late again?" Barbara answered, "Not funny." Dr. Oho locked the hall, said, "If you want to pass, start with punctuality." "I swear that man gets joy from failing people." Amaka teased, "You're always running, B. Maybe it's not just about class. Maybe it's time to slow down." Barbara suddenly slowed her steps and came to a pause. Her eyes narrowed as they met her own reflection in the glass window of the campus building. Her face looked tired, worn even. She stared for a moment, then quickly shook her head, pushing the thought aside. Barbara replied, "I'll slow down when I'm successful." There was a beat of silence before Amaka's voice softened on the phone. Amaka asked, "You sure you're chasing success or running from something?" Barbara didn't respond immediately. A loud honk from a car startled her. She blinked and looked away from the window. Barbara said, "Gotta catch my bus. Talk later." She ended the call and jogged across the road toward the nearby bus stop. As Barbara neared the bus stop, she thought she was simply catching a ride. But grace often arrived when least expected. The camera faded to a modest bus stop with a low bench and a cracked concrete pavement. A few people stood around, checking their watches or phones. At the far end of the bench sat an elderly woman in a teal shawl, sitting calmly like time didn't rush her. Her warm eyes silently followed Barbara as she arrived, slightly breathless. Barbara muttered to herself, "Of course, just missed it. What else is new?" She sighed and sat heavily on the bench, her bag slumping to her feet. She barely noticed the elderly woman beside her until a soft voice broke the silence. The woman, Grace, said gently, "You run like someone who's trying not to be caught." Barbara blinked in surprise and turned to face her. Barbara said, "Excuse me?" Grace replied, "Life. You run through it like it's chasing you. Like if you stop, something will catch up." Barbara let out a small, disbelieving laugh. Barbara asked, "Are you talking to me?" Grace smiled and said, "Only if you're listening." Barbara's frown returned, her natural defenses creeping in like armor. Barbara said, "Look, I've had a long day. I'm not in the mood for..." But Grace gently interrupted her. Grace said, "Some roads aren't meant to be escaped. They're meant to be walked through." Barbara stared at her, unsure how to respond. Before she could find words, a bus screeched to a stop. The other passengers began to rise. Barbara quickly grabbed her bag and boarded without looking back. The bus pulled away, leaving Grace sitting calmly, a knowing smile still on her face. Barbara sat by the window, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes locked on the world rushing by. But her mind wasn't in motion with the city. It was somewhere else entirely. The hum of the bus engine and the blur of passing cars faded into the background as Grace's words replayed in her mind. Grace's voice echoed in her thoughts. "Some roads aren't meant to be escaped. They're meant to be walked through." Barbara frowned and gave a quick shake of her head, like she was trying to physically eject the thought. Just then, a young boy sitting beside her dropped his juice box. It landed with a squish, and he immediately burst into tears. His mother leaned in and gently scolded him, then wiped his cheeks with the hem of her scarf. Barbara watched quietly, her expression softening, just for a moment. Then she turned her face back to the window, blinking hard. Barbara reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up to reveal a wallpaper, bold white text on a black background. Focus. Grind. Don't feel, just win. She sighed, then mindlessly began scrolling through Instagram. Her feed was filled with glowing smiles, graduation caps in the air, business launches, and filtered selfies captioned, "Winning season." She double-tapped one, but her face remained unreadable, her heart untouched. Her phone buzzed again, a Maka calling. Barbara glanced at it and hit ignore. She opened her notes app and unusually began typing. Her thumbs hesitated, the words coming slowly, like she was unsure she had the right to write them. Barbara thought as she typed, "Who even was that woman? And why do I feel like she saw me?" After a beat, she backspaced everything. The screen went blank. She locked the phone and slid it back into her bag. In the bus window, her reflection stared back at her. Tired, quiet, uncertain. The bus gave a small jolt as it came to a stop. The bus driver announced, "Ikeya Junction, next stop, Ohoda." Barbara stood up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and stepped off the bus. As she stepped down from the bus, the warm hues of sunset painted the street. Barbara walked briskly, keeping her head down. She passed a long row of street vendors, women shouting prices, smoke rising from roasted corn stands, children chasing one another with sticks and laughter. From the corner, a preacher with a megaphone bellowed into the crowd. The preacher cried out, "Repent and be saved. Tomorrow is not promised." Barbara rolled her eyes, the weight of the day pressing deeper into her bones. Barbara muttered under her breath, "Neither is today, apparently." She turned down a side street, approached a small gated compound, and punched in the entry code. The sounds of the street dimmed as the gate shut behind her. Barbara dropped her bag on the couch and collapsed beside it. Her cousin Lara sat on a nearby chair, stylish as ever, typing on her laptop. She looked up, smirking. Lara said, "You look like Lagos stepped on you." Barbara groaned, her voice muffled by exhaustion. Barbara replied, "It did," and reversed. Lara smirked again. Lara asked playfully, "You missed that Oho class again?" Barbara threw a pillow in her direction. Barbara snapped, "Don't. Just don't." Lara chuckled and returned to her typing. Barbara, meanwhile, pulled a soft blanket over her head and shut out the world. The room was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights creeping through the thin curtain. A ceiling fan spun slowly overhead, its hum low and steady. Barbara lay flat on a thin mattress, eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling above her. Across the room, Lara slept soundly, her breath deep and steady with the occasional light snore. Sleep came easily to some. For Barbara, night brought questions, the kind she kept buried deep, under books, achievements, and silence. Barbara shifted onto her side, her back facing Lara. The soft rustle of her blanket barely stirred the air. After a few silent moments, she exhaled quietly and sat up. Her bare feet touched the cold floor as she moved cautiously, careful not to wake her cousin. She knelt beside the mattress and reached underneath, dragging out a small plastic storage box, dusty, scratched, with a fading sticker that read, "For B, from Mum." Her fingers hovered over the lid. She hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside lay a handful of items. A tiny worn Bible with dog-eared pages, a photograph of a smiling woman in a nurse's uniform, a letter folded so many times the paper had begun to tear, a wooden cross, smooth and aged, strung on a thin thread. Barbara picked up the photo, holding it gently between her fingers. Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked the moisture away quickly. Barbara whispered, "You left too soon, Mum." Her fingers moved toward the letter but paused. Instead, she reached for the Bible. She flipped it open to a random page, and her eyes landed on a highlighted verse. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. Barbara stared at it, her face unreadable in the half-light. A beat passed, then she closed the Bible with a snap, placed all the items back inside, and slid the box back under the bed. She climbed into bed again, lying on her back, eyes fixed once more on the ceiling. But this time, the tears didn't stay hidden. Barbara lay back down, trying to find the same kind of peace Laura so easily slipped into each night. But her eyes remained wide open, unmoving, catching the dim light that filtered through the window. Barbara's voice echoed in her thoughts. "I'm not running, I'm surviving. That's different, right?" Her phone buzzed beside her pillow. The screen lit up briefly. A message from Amaka. Text, message. "Still up? You okay?" Barbara didn't answer. She simply reached for the phone, switched it off, and returned it to its place. Silence returned. Deeper now, more honest. The next day afternoon, Barbara entered the library briskly, her head slightly lowered, but her walk still carrying that sharp, purposeful edge. Her bag slung carelessly over one shoulder. As she moved through the corridor, she glanced at her phone, scanning for directions. Barbara muttered, "Room B12. Where is this meeting?" She stopped in front of a wooden door labeled Faith and Leadership Society, Weekly Reflections. Without hesitation, she pushed it open, thinking it was her tutorial venue. Inside, a small group of students sat in a quiet circle. A few were holding journals, others had open Bibles on their laps. The air was serene, the atmosphere almost sacred. A calm, steady voice filled the room. The group leader, a young man in his mid-20s, said, "Sometimes the path to healing starts with admitting you're lost and letting someone guide you home." Barbara froze in place. All eyes turned to her. There was no judgment, only gentle curiosity. Still, she felt too exposed. The group leader smiled and said, "Hi there. You're welcome. Come in." Barbara said awkwardly, Sorry, I think I walked into the wrong room." She began backing out, her usual confidence faltering. The group chuckled kindly. A young woman in the group said, "No such thing as wrong rooms here. Stay if you want." Barbara stood at the doorway, caught between leaving and lingering. Something in their eyes made her pause. They weren't mocking her. They simply saw her. The group leader said gently, "Or if you're not ready today, maybe next time." Barbara nodded stiffly, said nothing, and quietly closed the door behind her. Barbara stepped out and leaned back against the hallway wall just outside the door. Her breath escaped in a slow exhale, and she rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. That voice, that room, that feeling. She stood still for a few moments, then shook her head and walked away, her stride slower this time. Later that evening, Barbara sat at the edge of the open field, arms wrapped loosely around her knees. Around her, students laughed and shouted, kicking a football back and forth. She watched them from a distance, her face still and unreadable. Her phone buzzed beside her on the grass. Text message from Amaka. "Hey B, I heard about that Grace lady at the bus stop. My friend saw you two talking. Who was she?" Barbara stared at the message, her fingers hesitating over the keys. After a pause, she typed her reply. Barbara texted, "Not sure, but I think she saw something in me I've been hiding from myself." She placed the phone down beside her and slowly lay back on the grass, her eyes gazing up at the wide open sky. At the campus cafeteria, early evening. Barbara sat alone at a small table tucked into a quiet corner of the cafeteria. Earbuds were in her ears, though no music played, just a cover. Her food remained untouched on the tray. Beside it, her notebook lay open, the page nearly empty except for one line scrawled across it in frustrated pen strokes. "I don't know how to feel. I just know I feel tired." Her eyes lingered on the sentence. Then slowly, as though dragging each word from a deep place inside, she began to write again. Barbara's voice echoed internally as she wrote, "I met this woman yesterday. I don't even know her name. She smiled at me like I mattered, and for some stupid reason it stuck." She glanced around the cafeteria, subtly making sure no one was watching her. When she was sure, she continued writing. Barbara's voice continued. "She said something about purpose, that we're not accidents, that we're chosen. I don't know what she meant. I've been everything except chosen." Her pen paused. Tears welled up behind her eyes, but she blinked hard and wiped them away before they could fall. She shut the notebook firmly and slid it into her bag. Moments later, Amaka walked into the cafeteria and spotted Barbara almost instantly. She approached the table with her usual energy, tray in hand, but when she saw Barbara's face, her tone softened. Imaka said, "You've been dodging me, B." Barbara replied, "Not dodging, just dealing." Amaka sat down across from her, her expression gently concerned. Amaka asked, "You want to talk?" Barbara looked at her for a long second, her jaw tightening. Then she shook her head. Barbara said, "Not today." Amaka gave a small, understanding nod. She reached over and nudged her tray toward Barbara with a teasing smile. Amaka said, "At least eat. That journal won't feed you." Barbara's lips curved slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was closer than anything she'd given in days. She picked up her spoon and took a small bite, silent but present. Barbara stood at the sink, washing her hands slowly. The water ran over her fingers, but her eyes stayed locked on the mirror in front of her. She stared at her reflection, searching, questioning. Then, almost like breathing out a thought she didn't want to admit, she whispered to herself. Barbara said softly, "What do you even want from me, God?" No voice answered back, only the soft drip of a tap echoing through the tiled silence. Barbara stepped out of the building, her journal peeking from the half-zipped bag over her shoulder. The sky was glowing in the hues of dusk, pink, orange, and deepening purple. As she walked, something fluttered past her feet. She paused, bent down, and picked it up. It was a flyer. Campus Faith and Leadership Circle, Friday Reflection. Topic: The Unseen Battle, when you're tired of fighting alone. She stared at it for a moment, her expression unreadable. She almost crumpled it, then reconsidered. She folded the flyer carefully and tucked it into her journal. Barbara walked on, her steps a little slower, a little more aware, the campus growing quieter around her as dusk fell. The small chapel on campus glowed with warmth under soft golden lighting. A quiet buzz filled the space as scattered students occupied the pews, some chatting in low tones, others seated in peaceful silence. At the front of the room, a banner hung, Faith and Leadership Weekly Reflection, The Unseen Battle. Barbara stood just outside the chapel door. Her hand rested on the doorknob, fingers trembling slightly. Her breathing was shallow, heart pounding beneath her sweatshirt. With a quiet inhale, Barbara pushed the door open and stepped inside. A few students glanced up. The same young man she had seen before, the group leader, caught her eye from the front of the room and gave her a kind, welcoming nod. Barbara returned the nod, barely, then walked quickly to the back of the chapel. She sat alone in the last pew, her shoulders tight and her arms crossed protectively. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the polished wooden floor. Moments later, the group leader, Daniel, stood at the front with calm, steady presence. His voice filled the room, not loudly, but with deep sincerity. Daniel said, "Tonight's topic is for the fighters. Not the ones with medals, but the ones who are tired. The ones who smile on the outside but scream on the inside." Barbara shifted slightly in her seat. She was listening now, more than she expected. Daniel continued, "God sees that, and he's not asking for perfection, he's asking for surrender. Because grace doesn't meet you at the finish line. It finds you where you're broken, and stays." Barbara lowered her head, her arms loosened. She bit her lip gently, holding in the emotions that threatened to rise. Just then, the side door opened quietly. Grace entered the chapel with soft footsteps and took a seat in the front row. Barbara noticed. Her breath hitched. She froze. In her mind, the memory played again, clear and vivid. Grace's warm smile, her voice firm yet full of kindness. Grace had said, "You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are chosen." Barbara's eyes filled with tears. She blinked quickly and wiped them before they could fall. At the front, Grace turned slightly and saw her. They locked eyes. Grace didn't move. She didn't wave or rush over. She just nodded gently, a small, steady gesture. A silent message in that glance. "I see you. Welcome." Barbara lowered her gaze again. She let out a shaky breath, a sound somewhere between surrender and relief. Daniel stood again, inviting the room to linger if they needed to. He said gently, "If anyone wants to stay back, to pray or talk, feel free. You don't have to leave the same way you came." Some students rose and began to leave. Others stayed behind in hushed conversation or silent prayer. Barbara remained seated, still, quiet. unsure. Then Grace rose from her seat at the front. She began to walk toward the back, toward Barbara. Most students had left. Only a few lingered near the front. In the very last pew, Barbara sat quietly, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her journal. Footsteps echoed down the aisle. She didn't look up at first. Grace's voice came gently from beside her. Grace said softly, "You came." Barbara lifted her head slowly. Grace stood there, calm, gentle, without pressure, just presence. Barbara replied quietly, "Didn't plan to." Grace smiled. Those are often the best moments. A small pause passed between them, unrushed, honest. Grace asked gently, "How are you holding up?" Barbara hesitated. She gave a half shrug. Barbara said, "Still pretending I'm fine, but today made that harder." Grace sat down beside her, leaving just enough space to respect her comfort. Grace said, "Good. That means your soul's beginning to speak. Let it." Barbara let out a dry chuckle. Barbara said, "I'm not used to people saying things like that." Grace responded, "Because most people don't take time to listen. But God does. And so will I, if you ever want to talk." Barbara turned toward her. For the first time in a long while, she really looked at someone. Grace wasn't trying to fix her. She was just there. Barbara asked, "Why are you being so kind?" "You don't even know me," Grace said softly. "Maybe not yet, but I see you, and I know what it feels like to carry pain and wear pride like armor." Barbara blinked. She hadn't expected that. Grace continued, "You don't have to figure it all out tonight, but just know, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live, free." Barbara looked down again, emotion rising. Then barely a whisper. Barbara said, "I don't even know where to start." Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small new journal. She held it out gently. Grace said, "Start here. One word a day, one feeling, one truth." Barbara stared at the journal, then slowly took it from her hands. Moments later, the night air was cool and crisp. Stars dotted the dark sky above the chapel. Barbara and Grace stepped out together into the open space, their footsteps light against the stone steps. That night, something shifted. Not a full transformation, just the spark of one. Barbara paused at the top of the steps. She turned toward Grace. Barbara said, "Thank you for seeing me." Grace smiled and replied, "Thank you for showing up." Grace turned and walked into the night, her steps unhurried. Barbara remained there unmoving for a moment longer. She looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter now. She opened the journal Grace had given her and wrote a single word: hope. A soft breath escaped her lips, not heavy with exhaustion, but peaceful. The next day at the classroom, Barbara sat near the back of the lecture hall, nervously awaiting the return of her exam script. The professor moved row by row, handing out papers, some students celebrating quietly, others groaning. Finally, Barbara's paper landed on her desk. A red 38% glared up at her like a spotlight in the dark. Her throat tightened. Around her, voices blurred. She quickly folded the sheet and stuffed it into her bag. Professor Akande paused at her desk. Professor Akande said softly, "Barbara, can we talk after class?" Barbara nodded slightly, not trusting her voice. Shame sat heavy on her shoulders. Later, as students left, she walked slowly to the front. Professor Akande said, "You've got potential, but something's distracting you. Is everything okay?" Barbara mumbled, "I'm fine, just tired." Professor Akande said, "Barbara, don't let one stumble define you. You're capable of more than you believe." Barbara forced a smile, thanked him, and left, her eyes glassy. At Barbara's hostel late afternoon, Sam lay on Barbara's bed, scrolling through his phone, a bag of chips between them. Sam said, "I'm telling you, after this semester, we need a proper getaway. Just you, me, and no GPA stress." Barbara stood by the window, arms crossed. Barbara said, "I failed a major course, Sam. Do you get that? I'm not in the mood for fantasy trips." Sam replied, "I'm just trying to cheer you up. Maybe laugh a little." Barbara said, "Well, I don't feel like laughing." The room thickened with silence. Sam said, Barbara, I know things have been hard, but you don't have to shut me out. Barbara snapped, you don't understand. You've never had your life spiral like this. Sam looked hurt. He grabbed his bag and quietly headed for the door. Sam said, call me when you want to talk, not fight. He left. Barbara sighed deeply, her eyes closed tight. Later that night, Barbara stopped by her mailbox on her way in. She flipped through the usual clutter, but one brown envelope made her hand freeze. Her name was written in cursive, familiar, painful. She looked around. Nobody was watching. She tucked it into her bag like it was a secret. Barbara walked through the vibrant market, buying fruit, still distracted. She browsed a book stall and saw a display of sketch pads. She picked one up absent-mindedly. Grace's voice came from off-screen. Grace said, did you ever open the letter? Barbara turned sharply. Grace was beside her, holding a paper bag of groceries. Barbara said, you always have this habit of showing up. Grace smiled and said, or maybe you're starting to look in the right places. Barbara rolled her eyes but didn't walk away. Grace said, we carry pain in pockets we forget to empty. You should see what's inside that letter. Barbara's walls were back up. Barbara said, you don't know me. Don't act like you do. She walked away, slowly. Late afternoon at the campus park, Sam and Barbara sat at opposite ends of a bench, tension crackling. Sam said, Barbara, what are we doing? She said nothing. Sam said softly, I feel like I'm dating a ghost. You never let me see the real you. Barbara said, maybe the real me is someone you wouldn't like. Sam said, let me be the judge of that, but I can't keep reaching for someone who's always pulling away. She looked at him, tears threatening. Sam stood up and said, I love you, B, but love needs room to breathe. Right now, it's suffocating. He walked away. Barbara remained still for a long while. Later that night, Barbara sat on the edge of her bed. The envelope was in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she finally opened it. She pulled out a single sheet. Her eyes scanned the words, simple, raw. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. Father's voice said in voiceover, Barbara, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I never stopped thinking about you. I'm sorry. Her breath caught. The words kept coming. Apologies, regrets, memories, a line about her brother's accident. She burst into quiet, gut-wrenching sobs. Then Barbara had a flashback. Young Barbara and Deal chased each other. Joyful chaos. Deal slipped on a toy and crashed into the floor. Blood, screams. Mother screamed, Barbara! What did you do? Young Barbara cried. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. Barbara curled into a ball, clutching the letter. The sun hung low, casting a golden light over the gravestones. Barbara stood in front of her younger brother's grave for the first time in years, framed by loose, wavy black hair that brushed her shoulders. Her hands trembled as she brushed fallen leaves from the stone. Barbara knelt and placed a single white lily on the grave, her fingers shaking. She whispered, her voice breaking, Deal, I'm sorry. I never meant to. But no sound followed. She stared at the gravestone's date, guilt rushing through her chest. Sitting down before the grave, Barbara hugged her knees to her chest and held her breath as the world seemed to fade around her. Later, Barbara sat on a nearby weathered bench, the cemetery still cloaked in the morning hush. The unopened letter from her father rested beside her, its edges worn. Her eyes were heavy with hesitation. Finally, Barbara pulled the letter out, smoothing the creases with careful fingers. She took a deep breath and began to read aloud. Barbara's voice trembled as she read, Barbara, it's hard for me to write this, but you deserve the truth about your brother, about what happened that day, and about my failures. I left because I was ashamed. I never blamed you, but I couldn't face you anymore. I never knew how to tell you the truth, but I hope that one day you will understand. You have my deepest apology. Always your father. Her voice broke on the final sentence. She swallowed hard, staring at her brother's grave, searching for answers that would never come. Barbara wiped away a tear and folded the letter back up, the air now unbearably heavy. In the classroom, Barbara sat at her desk, staring blankly at the lecture slides projected on the board. The professor's voice became a muted murmur. Her mind drifted. Images flashing, Dele's accident, her mother's screams, her father walking away. The past never really leaves. It's always there, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. Barbara's hands clenched into fists on the desk, her nails digging painfully into the wood. The professor called out to her, "Barbara, do you have anything to add to the discussion?" Startled, Barbara blinked rapidly and shook her head. She said weakly, "Sorry, I wasn't paying attention." The professor offered an understanding smile. Barbara's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she looked down. Back at her hostel, Barbara flopped onto her bed, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. As she shifted, a colorful flyer slipped from her bag and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up absent-mindedly. It was a flyer for a youth mentorship program at the local church. Her heart skipped a beat. Barbara stared at the flyer, her thumb running over the printed words. She hadn't stepped inside a church in months. She bit her lip, thinking hard. Finally, she tucked the flyer carefully into her notebook. Later that evening, Barbara stood at the foot of the church steps, staring up at the tall white building. The evening sun painted long shadows across the entrance. Inside, she could hear music and laughter. Barbara gripped the strap of her bag tighter. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and climbed the first step. The heavy church door creaked open, and Barbara stepped inside. A wash of warmth and noise greeted her. Laughter, music, chattering voices. Barbara hovered awkwardly near the entrance, unsure where to go. A cheerful volunteer, Temmie, spotted her immediately. Temmie smiled brightly and asked, "Hey, are you here for the mentorship program?" Barbara nodded, her smile hesitant. Temmie said warmly, "Great. Come in. We're just getting started." Temmie led Barbara deeper into the lively lobby, past groups of laughing young adults and teenagers. Barbara's shoulders relaxed a little as she moved through the crowd. Later, Barbara found herself settling into a pew near the back of the church sanctuary. The room was calm, lit softly by overhead lights. She glanced around, unsure of what to expect. Her heart raced. Then she saw her, Grace. Grace sat quietly in a pew across the room, her hands folded gently in her lap, her curly hair pulled back loosely. Her eyes were closed in silent prayer. When Grace noticed Barbara looking, she opened her eyes and smiled warmly. Grace said softly, "You came." Barbara smiled back, a small, genuine smile. Barbara sat stiffly on a plastic chair in a circle of about 15 other young adults. The room carried a quiet energy, uncertain yet expectant. Some participants looked nervous, fidgeting with their fingers. Others spoke confidently, their voices steady. Barbara's arms were folded tightly across her chest, her body wrapped in discomfort. The group leader spoke gently, saying, "Here, we share stories, not to compare scars, but to remember we're not alone." One by one, the others opened up. Stories of anxiety, guilt, failed dreams, and broken families filled the room like whispers from aching hearts. Barbara didn't speak, but her heart listened deeply. Each story reflected parts of her she didn't know were still alive. As the room softened with vulnerability, Barbara's arms slowly dropped, just a little, like a shield lowering. Precious, a slim girl with round glasses, shared about losing her mother to cancer. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her battle with anger toward God. A boy named Jide followed, tall with expressive eyes and an afro, sharing his struggles with identity and shame. Barbara watched them both. She didn't say a word, but her heart absorbed everything. Empathy rose in her like a tide. Something inside her softened, and a flicker of hope emerged, quiet but steady. After the session, Barbara leaned against a cream-colored pillar in the quiet courtyard. The orange hue of the setting sun bathed everything in warmth. Grace approached, her footsteps soft and her presence calming. "You listened so intently today. That's a brave thing, Barbara," Grace said gently. Barbara shrugged, unsure how to respond. Grace extended a small, blank notebook. "Sometimes writing helps. When you can't speak to God, speak to your journal. Just be honest," she said with a soft smile. Barbara took it with hesitation but curiosity dancing in her eyes. Barbara knelt beside her bed. The journal sat closed beside her. She clasped her hands, but no words came. Her throat tightened. Her chest ached with unspoken pain. "God, I I don't even know what to say, Barbara whispered, voice hoarse. She clenched her fists and gritted her teeth. Forget it, she said, falling back onto the bed, tears threatening to fall. The room remained still. The next day, Barbara sat alone in the church foyer, flipping through her untouched journal. Temmie approached, cheerful as always, her smile infectious. How's the journal going? Temmie asked. I haven't written anything yet. Tried praying last night. It felt stupid, Barbara said honestly. Temmie chuckled softly. It's not about sounding perfect. Start small. One thing you're grateful for. That's enough. Barbara nodded slowly, heart softening. After the session ended, Barbara stayed behind to help. She swept the floor, stacked chairs, and wiped down tables. The mundane work felt almost meditative. A little boy spilled water nearby. Barbara smiled and handed him a new cup without hesitation. She paused, she had smiled. And it wasn't forced. Barbara sat on the church steps as the sun dipped low. Her journal rested on her lap, opened for the first time. A few lines were written on the first page. Today I stayed. I helped. I smiled. Thank you, God, for this seed. She looked up at the soft sky and exhaled slowly, a genuine smile forming on her face. The next morning, Barbara sat quietly in a circle of new volunteers inside the well-lit church meeting room. The walls were cream-colored with scripture posters neatly aligned. A whiteboard at the front bore the words, Mentorship, Healing Through Service. Mrs. Tunde stood confidently before them. Mrs. Tunde said, You're not here to fix people. You're here to walk with them. And sometimes they'll show you parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Barbara, pen in hand, nodded slightly, her brows knitted in thought. She felt nervous but hopeful. Barbara was led into a cozy but modest church office, where a teenage girl sat slouched on a couch. This is Naya, Mrs. Tunde said. She's had a rough year. Try to be patient with her. Barbara crouched slightly, making eye contact. Barbara said gently, Hi, Nia. I'm Barbara. I'm not here to judge you, just to be your friend. Nia scoffed. You're not my friend. You're just another church girl who thinks she knows everything. Barbara's smile faltered. Barbara sat on a weathered bench beside Nia in the church garden. The birds chirped in the background, but tension sat thick between them. I used to be angry too, Barbara said. At everyone, even at God. Nia shrugged. Yeah? Still seems like you are. Barbara blinked, stunned. Her mouth parted, but no words came. You talk soft, Nia added, but your eyes look tired, like you're still mad at something. Barbara looked down, her silence louder than any reply. Later that day at the church library, rows of books surrounded Barbara as she found Grace shelving devotionals. The room smelled of paper and peace. Barbara dropped beside her, sighing. She's impossible, Barbara said. Every word feels like a fight. I don't know why they gave her to me. Maybe she reminds you of who you used to be, Grace said. Maybe she's not here to be changed. The next day, the rec room in the basement was quiet except for Barbara and Nia. Barbara's brows tightened. A deck of cards sat between them. Nia rolled her eyes and swept the cards onto the floor. Healing others often holds up a mirror. Why do you even try? We can't run from what we see. You're fake. You smile, but I see through it. Barbara's temper snapped. You think you're the only one who hurts? You don't even know me, Barbara shouted. Nia flinched, her expression flickering between anger and sadness. Barbara stood abruptly and walked out, her breath shaky. Later that night, at Barbara Hostel, Barbara sat cross-legged on her bed, the dim bulb above casting a tired glow. Her journal lay open, words scribbled furiously. God, I failed today. I hurt someone who needed healing. I saw myself in her, and I hated it. She shut the journal, her chest heaving. Then she dropped her head into her hands, overwhelmed. The next day, Barbara found Nia alone on a concrete bench, earbuds in, a wall around her. Barbara sat beside her, saying nothing at first. Then softly, I'm sorry for yelling. I was scared because you reminded me of who I was and who I still am sometimes. Nia pulled out one earbud. Her gaze was curious but guarded. Barbara added, but I'm still learning, and I want to try again, if you'll let me. A beat passed. Whatever, Nia mumbled, but I get to pick the game next time. Barbara chuckled. It wasn't a fix, but it was a start. Barbara stood across the road from a modest house with faded yellow paint and a crooked wooden fence. It was her childhood home, worn by time and weather. She clutched her bag tightly, unmoving, her gaze locked on the place that held more memories than she was ready to face. She didn't take a step forward. She just watched. Through the front window, she saw her father, older now, with graying hair and slouched shoulders. His movements were slow, his expression blank as he stared at the flickering TV. The weight in Barbara's chest rose to her eyes. She wiped away a tear and slowly turned away. Barbara walked slowly down the sidewalk, her footsteps unsteady. Her thoughts drifted far from the present. Flashback her childhood home. Years ago, 10-year-old Barbara crouched behind a curtain, her small body trembling. Her parents' voices echoed through the house. Barbara's mother shouted from the kitchen, her voice thick with anger. "You said you were watching them. How could you let this happen?" Her father shouted back, hands in the air. "I turned away for just a second. I didn't mean to. God knows I didn't." On the floor lay a broken toy car. The tension in the room was suffocating. Young Barbara clutched a crumpled drawing, tears running silently down her cheeks. Barbara blinked, trying to steady her breathing. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the memory pressing on her like a heavy coat. Afternoon, in a quiet corner of the church library, Barbara sat across from Temmie. The room was peaceful, filled with shelves of devotionals and journals. Barbara's hands were clasped in her lap, her voice low. Barbara said softly, "I think I blame myself for everything. My brother's death, my parents' pain, the silence that followed." Temmie listened intently, her hands folded and her gaze full of kindness. Barbara continued, "I thought if I stayed away, I'd be sparing them from more disappointment." Temmie replied gently, "That little girl carried something far too heavy for her small heart. It's time she was forgiven." Barbara lowered her eyes, her voice caught in her throat. Barbara sat at her small desk in the corner of her hostel room. The only light came from a desk lamp casting a gentle glow on the paper before her. She held a pen above the sheet, frozen in thought. Then slowly she began to write. Her voice quivered as she wrote aloud, "Dear little me, you did your best. You were just a child. It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry for carrying so much pain in silence. You deserve to be hugged, not blamed." Tears streamed down her face and fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. But she didn't stop writing. She poured it all out. Later that night, Barbara lay curled on her bed, hugging her knees. The letter was still clutched in her hand. Her pillow was wet with tears, but her breathing had begun to slow. The moonlight streamed through the curtain, washing the room in soft silver hues. She stared at the ceiling, silent but no longer weighed down. Early morning, Barbara walked through the quiet cemetery, her steps slow and steady. Dew clung to the grass. In her hand, she carried the letter, folded with care. She reached a small headstone marked with her brother's name. Kneeling beside it, she laid the letter down gently and traced her fingers over the engraved words. Barbara said softly, "I miss you. I love you. I'm sorry, and I'm ready to live again." She sat still for a moment, breathing deeply. Not crying, just being. Barbara stood slowly and looked up at the pale morning sky. The light was gentle, softening the world around her. She inhaled, her chest rising with something new, something like hope. She didn't look back. Her feet moved forward, steady and certain. In the morning, Barbara sat alone near the entrance of the quiet church, the afterglow of morning devotion still lingering in the air. In her hand was a worn letter from her father, creased at the edges, the ink slightly smudged from repeated reading. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through her phone, pausing at his contact. With a deep breath, Barbara pressed call. Barbara said quietly, "Hello. I think it's time we talked." A pause on the line. Her father responded gently, "Barbara, I'd like that." She ended the call with a shaky breath, her heart pounding as if she'd just stepped into a storm she wasn't sure she was ready for. Later in the afternoon, Barbara walked into the modest cafe, eyes darting around until they landed on the familiar, hunched figure in the corner. Her father sat nervously, his graying hair and weathered face betraying years of silence. His hands twisted around one another. She sat across from him, space between them thick with memories and regret. Her father said quietly, "You look like your mother." Barbara didn't reply. Staring at the glass of water the waiter set down in front of her, he said, voice cracking, "I failed you. I failed both of us. After the accident, I didn't know how to be a father anymore." Barbara sat in still silence, her jaw clenched to keep from falling apart. The silence snapped like a twig under pressure. Barbara slammed her palm on the table, the glass rattling. Her voice rose, raw, shaking. Barbara shouted, "You disappeared! You left me alone with that guilt. I was a child, and you let me carry it." The other customers looked up. Her father winced but said nothing. Barbara continued, "Do you know how many nights I cried? How many birthdays I sat by the door, hoping you'd come?" Her father looked down, ashamed. He whispered, "I didn't know how to fix it. I thought staying away was what you needed." Barbara said through clenched teeth, "You were wrong." The silence that followed was heavy and real. Later that evening, Barbara collapsed onto her bed, drained from the confrontation. Her eyes were red, her chest tight. A soft knock sounded. Barbara opened the door to find Grace holding a paper bag. Grace said, "Brought you jollof rice. Didn't know if you'd eaten." Barbara stepped aside without a word. Grace placed the bag on the table and sat beside her on the bed. There were no questions, no sermons, just presence. She gently placed a hand on Barbara's. The room now darker, Barbara sat cross-legged on the bed, phone to her ear. Her voice was quiet, unsure. Barbara said, "I met him. I thought I'd feel lighter, but I just feel confused, angry, and guilty all over again." Temmie's voice came through gently. Temmie said, "That's part of it. Forgiveness isn't a feeling, it's a decision, and it takes time." Barbara asked, "What if I don't know how?" Temmie responded, "You start by wanting to. That's enough for now." Barbara exhaled shakily, as though releasing something she didn't know she was holding. Temmie's voice continued calm and sure. Temmie said, "Forgiveness doesn't excuse what they did, Barbara. It frees you from carrying it forever. It's not about letting them off the hook. It's about setting yourself free." Barbara sat motionless, absorbing every word. Her father's apology echoed in her mind. So did her own pain. Barbara whispered, "Then I want to try." Temmie said warmly, "That's enough. That's brave." The sun hadn't fully risen. The compound was quiet. Barbara stepped outside with her journal in hand. She walked to the base of a wide tree and sat down, opening the journal on her lap. She began to write, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over pain. Today I choose to begin." The air felt lighter. The sky stretched wide above her. She looked up and smiled, soft and real. In the morning, Barbara lay curled beneath a blanket on her bed, surrounded by shadows. The blinds remained shut, casting dim stripes of light across the unkempt room. A bowl of cereal sat untouched on the desk, now stale. Her phone screen lit up with a string of missed calls. Temmie, Grace, the church group chat. Without emotion, Barbara silenced the phone. A knock echoed through the door, but she didn't move. She turned to face the wall, her expression vacant. Slowly, silent tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. Later in the afternoon, Temmie paced inside a small church office cluttered with papers and notes. Her voice carried urgency as she spoke on the phone. Temmie said, "She hasn't shown up in days, I'm worried. But it's not just her." She paused, voice softening. Temmie added, "It's Naya. She got into a fight, and now the school wants to expel her." With a deep sigh, she hung up and redialed. This time, Barbara. Barbara's hand hovered over the phone. Then finally she answered. Barbara said groggily, "Hello." Temmie said, "Nia's in trouble, Barb. She needs you." Barbara sat up slowly. The words echoed in her chest. Barbara walked up the worn path to a cramped house. Shouting and loud music poured from inside. On the porch sat Nia, arms crossed, expression guarded. Barbara approached gently. Barbara asked, "Hey, you okay?" Nia snapped, "Why do you care? Thought you disappeared like everyone else." Barbara flinched, guilt written on her face. Barbara replied, "I shouldn't have. I'm sorry, Nia." She knelt beside the girl, her voice tender. Barbara continued, "You matter, even if no one's ever said it out loud." You matter. Nia's wall began to crumble, her face trembling with unshed tears. Later that day, Barbara entered the youth room hesitantly. Inside, the youth group sat in a semicircle mid-discussion, eyes turned as she stepped in. Temmie smiled warmly. Grace leaned over. Grace whispered, "You came back." Barbara nodded silently, her eyes shining. Moments later, Barbara raised her hand. Her voice shook. Barbara said, "I've been struggling, a lot, with guilt and anger. I thought staying away would protect me, but it only made things worse." The room was silent. Grace gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Barbara added, "But I realized, helping someone doesn't mean being perfect. It just means showing up." Temmie smiled. Others nodded in understanding. Late night, Barbara opened her sketchbook and flipped to a worn crayon drawing. Her family, her father, brother, and younger self. She placed it in an envelope and began to write. Barbara whispered, "I forgive you. I'm learning to forgive myself too." She sealed the envelope with care and placed it in her bag. Early morning, Barbara dropped the envelope into a red mailbox on a quiet street. She breathed deeply. Grace appeared with 2 steaming cups of tea. Grace said, "That took strength." Barbara replied, "It still hurts." Grace said, "Healing always does." At first, they walked side by side down the street, the sunrise casting golden light over them. Grace added, "But now your healing can begin." Barbara looked upward, a faint smile breaking through. The next day, Barbara sat at a study desk tucked between tall shelves lined with academic books. Her desk was cluttered with open textbooks, colorful highlighters, and neatly written notes. She leaned forward, her brows furrowed in deep concentration as her pen scratched against the paper. For the first time in weeks, her mind felt clear. A small smile tugged at her lips as she solved a particularly difficult problem. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft rustling of pages and distant typing. A lecturer walked past, pausing briefly when he spotted her. The lecturer said, "Barbara, your latest paper? Excellent work. Keep it up." Barbara nodded, shyly pleased. Quiet pride settled in her chest. Later that evening, at the youth room, Barbara stood confidently before a circle of teenagers seated on plastic chairs. The walls were adorned with posters and Bible verses. The lighting was soft, cozy, and inviting. Her voice was steady as she shared her truth. Barbara said, "I used to carry guilt like a shadow. It followed me everywhere. But when I stopped hiding, it started to shrink." The room remained still. Even the most fidgety teens were listening now. From the back of the room, Temmie stood watching her with glistening eyes. Barbara continued, "You don't have to be perfect to grow. You just have to show up and try." As her words hung in the air, a wave of applause broke out. Grace clapped slowly, her smile full of quiet approval. Late afternoon, Barbara and Nia walked slowly along a winding park path, dry leaves crunching beneath their shoes. The sky was golden, casting warm light over the trees. Barbara's hands were in her hoodie pockets while Nia kicked a small pebble ahead of them, her expression uncertain. Nia said hesitantly, "Sometimes, I think I'm too messed up to change." Barbara looked at her with understanding eyes. Barbara said, "I used to feel the same, like I was trapped by my past, but people believed in me, even when I didn't." Nia kept her gaze down, quietly kicking another stone. Nia said, "I'm scared to trust anyone." Barbara said, "That's okay. Start small. Trust one thing, like this moment." Nia looked up at her and after a pause nodded softly. Barbara sat across from Temmie in the modest church office. Papers, clipboards, and devotionals were neatly stacked around the room. Barbara slid a crisp envelope across the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. Barbara said, "I want to apply for the mentorship leadership role." Temmie opened the envelope and smiled warmly as she read. Temmie said, "You've come a long way, Barbara. This is beautiful." Barbara straightened up, taking a deep breath. Barbara said, "I don't have it all figured out, but I know I want to help people grow the way you and Grace helped me." Temmie nodded proudly. Temmie said, "Then you're ready." That evening, the garden was serene as the sun dipped low. Sam sat on a bench under a tree, hands clasped nervously. Barbara approached calmly, a sense of peace in her posture. Sam said, "Thanks for coming. wanted to talk. Barbara said, "Me too." They sat side by side, a quiet moment stretching between them. Sam said, "I was hurt, but I also know you were hurting more." Barbara looked at him sincerely. Barbara said, "I'm sorry for pushing you away. I wasn't ready. I didn't even know who I was." Sam asked, "And now?" Barbara smiled gently. Barbara said, "I'm becoming her." They embraced. It was a goodbye, but without bitterness, just peace. The next day at Sunday morning service, soft worship music filled the church sanctuary. Barbara stood near the front, eyes closed in reverence. She opened her eyes and glanced back, and froze. Her father had entered through the main doors, holding a worn Bible awkwardly. He stood unsure, scanning the room until their eyes met. Barbara walked toward him slowly. He braced himself, but she smiled warmly. Barbara said softly, "I'm glad you came." He nodded, eyes overwhelmed with emotion. She led him to a seat, and they sat together. Across the aisle, Grace watched them, a quiet smile on her face. Barbara stood at the church podium, a soft glow of stage lights surrounding her. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the microphone, but her eyes glowed. Barbara said, "There was a time I didn't think I deserved healing, or peace, or love, but God never stopped reaching for me." Behind her, a screen flashed photos from youth mentorship events, smiles, laughter, and shared prayers. In the audience, Nia sat beaming, surrounded by others. Barbara continued, her voice teary, "If you're struggling, you're not alone. And if you've messed up, you're not disqualified." The congregation broke into applause. Temi wiped her eyes from the front row. Barbara stepped down and was immediately embraced by Grace, who pulled her into a warm hug. The next at the activity room, Barbara stood at the center of the busy room, colorful posters taped to walls, volunteers moving quickly around her. She directed with confidence. Barbara said, "Let's set up the food table by the entrance and the spoken word stage near the courtyard. Remember, today's about making people feel seen." Temi entered, pausing with a smile, visibly impressed. Temi said, "Look at you, a real leader now." Barbara laughed, organizing donated clothes easily, her movements brisk but graceful. Barbara said, "I just want it to be meaningful, for someone to leave feeling like they matter." That afternoon, the courtyard buzzed with music and chatter, a canopy overhead shading the gathering. Nia stepped nervously onto the small wooden stage, clutching the microphone. Nia said, her voice trembling, "I was once drowning in silence, but someone believed in me loud enough to make me float." Barbara stood among the crowd, teary-eyed, nodding encouragingly. Nia continued, her voice growing stronger. "She didn't try to fix me. She just stood with me. And that saved me." The crowd erupted into applause. Barbara clapped hard, pride glowing on her face. The church back room was dim and quiet, a soft lamp casting a warm glow. Barbara sat next to Grace, sipping juice from a paper cup, the muffled sounds of the event lingering outside. Barbara said, "How do you always know the right thing to say?" Grace smiled softly, her curly hair framing her kind face. Grace said, "Because I've lived long enough to know what silence can cost." Her voice dipped into memory. Grace continued, "I lost someone too. Blamed myself for years, but Grace doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to live with it." Barbara touched, reached out, and held Grace's hand gently. Later evening at Barbara Hostel, Barbara opened her door to Laura, who stood awkwardly, twisting her fingers. Laura said, "Hey, I saw the flyer about your event. You really pulled it off." A heavy pause settled between them. Laura continued, voice cracking, "I also wanted to say, I was wrong back then. Telling you faith was a waste. You've changed, Barb." Barbara's face softened, surprised. Barbara said, "Thanks. I had to lose everything to find what mattered." They embraced tightly, a hug full of unspoken forgiveness. The next day at school, Barbara walked through the bustling campus hallway. Textbooks hugged to her chest. Several classmates turned to look at her, admiration flashing across their faces. Classmate 1 said, "Hey Barbara, could I talk to you after class? You always look so grounded lately." Classmate 2 chimed in, smiling warmly. "Yeah, me too. You're different now, in a good way." Barbara paused, caught between surprise and humility. Barbara said, "Sure, I'd love to." She walked on, her smile private and peaceful. Barbara stood at the front desk of the Student Center. A staff member handed her an envelope with a proud smile. Staff said, "You've been nominated for the Campus Impact Leadership Award. You're one of the most inspiring stories this year." Barbara's hands trembled slightly as she read the nomination form. Staff continued encouragingly, "Keep doing what you're doing. You've made waves." Barbara laughed softly, almost disbelieving, her eyes wide with gratitude. Later that day, the church sanctuary was empty and dim, only the soft glow of wall sconces lighting the pews. Barbara and Grace sat together in the front row, Grace's arm draped around Barbara's shoulders. Grace said, "From the moment I met you, I knew. You weren't broken. You were becoming." Barbara leaned into her shoulder, peace radiating from her relaxed posture. Grace said softly, "You were always meant to be more." Barbara smiled against Grace's shoulder. Barbara whispered, "I finally believe that too." The next morning, Barbara arrived early to prepare for Sunday service. She greeted the secretary with a smile, but the woman looked away awkwardly. Barbara said, "Everything okay?" The secretary replied, "Pastor wants to speak with you." "Something about finances." Confused, Barbara entered the pastor's office. He sat across from her, grave. The pastor said, "Barbara, someone has accused you of mismanaging outreach funds." Barbara, shocked, said, "What? That's not possible. I submit every receipt, every time." The pastor slid a paper toward her, a printed email of the anonymous accusation. Her world tilted. Later at the church hallway, Barbara walked through the corridor. Whispers trailed her. Voice 1 whispered, "She always looked too good to be true." Voice 2 added, "Guess all that change was for show." Her hands trembled as she opened her locker, her faith tested. Barbara said to herself, "Lord, is this what standing for good gets me?" She considered quitting, fleeing. At the church parking lot that afternoon, Barbara sat on the curb trying to stay calm. Suddenly, Nia and Temmie walked up. Nia said, "You think we're going to let them tear you down like that?" Temmie added, "Barbara, we've seen your integrity. Let us speak for you." Barbara looked up, overwhelmed by the loyalty in their eyes. Barbara said, "But what if people don't believe you either?" Standing. Then Barbara said, "And sometimes being tested is just another way of being chosen." The auditorium was filled with students, mentors, and church leaders. The backdrop read, "Youth Convention, Rise and Lead," and soft lighting cast a golden hue across the wide stage. Barbara stepped behind the podium. Her natural curls bounced with every step, framing her warm, determined face. The murmurs among the audience faded into complete silence. She placed her notes down carefully, looked up at the crowd, took a deep breath, and spoke. Barbara said, "If you had told me a year ago I'd be standing here, I would have laughed. Or cried, maybe both." Though her voice trembled slightly, she pushed forward, her eyes steady, her heart full. Barbara began to share her story. She talked about her brokenness, her failure, her anger, and the loss of her brother. She spoke openly about her bitterness toward her father. Barbara said, "I thought healing was about forgetting. Turns out it's about forgiving and facing the mirror with grace." As she spoke, a montage played across the projection screen above her. Little Barbara laughing with her brother, the terrible accident, and scenes from the hospital.